So I've been asked to talk about the Lindenhall Library and what it means to me. It's been a fundamental part of my life since the early 1980s. I was a student studying my an O-level economic history in between GCSEs and A levels, and I did all my studying for that O-level in lower sixth at the Lindenhall Library at the prompting of my history A-level teacher Jerry McDonald, who championed the Linen Hall at the time. It became even more useful in A-level history because a third of the history exam would be based on the United Irish movement, the late 18th century in Belfast, up to the Act of Union, the rebellion, of course, before that. And it provided valuable resources in terms of looking at things like the Northern Star, actual microfiche copies of the United Irish paper at the time. There were numerous biographies you could pick off the shelves of various key figures in the United Irishman, from Jimmy Hope, William Drennan, people like that. And it was interesting in terms of it gave you a much more comprehensive and complex picture of what happened to those leading figures after the defeat of the rebellion and the Act of Union. Many of them, in fact, abandoning the old cause, so to speak. So from a very early age, it became a place where you used to meet your friends after school, go and do a couple of hours of study. And in many ways, I always get a little frisson of almost like traveling back in time when I'm in the library researching or writing, to see kids, from 16, 17, 18-year-old there at the table in their school uniforms. I'm transported back to myself in the early 1980s. You also see a lot of students. I did a lot of studying there too. What does it mean today? It's been extremely useful down through the years. I've written 9 non-fiction books, most of them on Northern Ireland, and there's been invaluable mines of information in terms of the raw material for the books. So writing books about the INLA, for instance, all the old publications, Republican publications, where they're at our fingertips from the political collection. And indeed, as a thank you to the work the Lindenhall Library provided us with and the material, the rich seam of material, the late Jack Holland and myself, us the co-authors of INLA Deadly Divisions, we donated all our material that we acquired from primary sources. You're talking people in the INLA and the RSP and so on. All those things that were handed over to us, internal minutes of meetings of the HBUC committees, of IRSP, Central Committee meetings, and so on and so forth. We donated all of that in an archive to the Lindenhall Political Collection when Yvonne Murphy was in charge of it. And I'm delighted to say people are still using it to this day. I recently gave permission for our archive to be used for Patrick Bishop, who was doing the esteemed international journalist and author, when he was doing a book on the Uri Neve, and our material proved to be pretty important in terms of that. So again, that's a long-standing connection way back to 1994. All of the Loyalist publications that we sourced were all from the Lindenhall Political Collection. When Jim Cusack and I co-authored UVF and then UDA, Inside the Heart of Loyalist Terror, those 2 books, which were constantly updated, and all Ulster Magazine, the Purple Standard, Combat, way back to the 1970s, stuff that I long forgotten about. These things existed. Pamphlets, books, position papers, and so on. It was similar for every book with a Northern Ireland context. When I did the biography of David Trimble, a lot of his own writings, including his thoughts on the executions of the 1916 rebels, he wrote an historical pamphlet on that. They were all in the political collection. It is an invaluable resource, and I'm delighted to have made my small contribution to that archive with our INLA material. And Jack was too. Jack Holland, much lamented, much missed. He also valued the Linen Hall Library. It was a special place in his heart, and he always went when he was in Belfast to the Linen Hall, not only for research purposes or to get some space in a quiet place in the city centre, but also to meet people and also to avail of the excellent cafe, which I say is something I always miss, I always yearn for when I'm not here, if I'm working in London or living down in the English South Coast. So it had a special relationship with us in terms of all our research endeavours, both myself and Jim Cusack, down through the years. And in recent times, it's become useful as well in terms of my new venture, which is into the world of fiction and the novels. And particularly this shameless plug, Two Souls, my latest novel about Belfast in the 1970s and 80s, amidst a trio of disreputable characters. A lot of the social detail that I had to write about in that book came from stuff I sourced in the Linen Hall Library. So, for instance, what did Belfast look like? I mean, how different did it look like in the 70s? The ring of steel security fences. What were the shops like? What did Little Woods look like? In your audio-visual collection, there wasn't as valuable material there for anyone trying to reimagine, to rekindle memory about what Belfast looked like at the time. And I found that really useful in terms of conjuring up passages in the book, especially towards the end, about walking through the city centre, going through the security barriers, the shops that were there at the time that don't exist anymore. I think in Little Woods, Caroline Music is another place, the Blackthorn Bar. But just the look of Corn Market, for instance, all that is captured on film in the audiovisual section of the library as well. So it isn't just books, obviously. You come across things you don't expect. So, for example, earlier this year, I was in the library around about before the coronavirus lockdown. I was in the library on sabbatical, away from the Guardian, researching my new book, which is basically set in two time frames. And one time frame is World War One, and it's based loosely around my great grandfather, Samuel Stewart, who survived the Battle of the Somme. He was in the 36th Ulster Division. He had been previously in the UVF, Carson's army, and he then is killed at the Battle of Ypres in 1917. Not giving too much away about that novel, but I was various things I was thinking about. So obviously books like Philip Orr's Road to the Somme and Cyril Fall's old book about the 36th Ulster Division. They're on you can pluck them off the shelves and have a look and make notes. But even other things, like I was thinking about Francis Ledwidge's poetry, a much neglected Irish and indeed overall war poet, superb writer, who also fought in the First World War, and was killed indeed there. And one day, just by accident, I was browsing the Irish poetry section near one of the windows that overlooks Wellington Place, and I came across a book that I didn't know existed, which was dedicated to Ledwidge's life. It was a kind of a mini biography containing some of his poetry, and also an appreciation by Seamus Heaney of Ledwidge's poetic work. And it was not only inspiring in terms of atmosphere of the time and the way people spoke, the way people talked, but also because even a thing like, for instance, I've got one of the quotes that I'm going to use. I like quotes at the start of a novel that set the tone. So, Two Souls, the novel I've just shown you, it's a quote from Goethe, which is the origin of the title. Two souls, alas, reside in my breast, and each will fight for the mastery there. In Ledwidge's book, there's a quote from an Irish aristocrat, Anglo-Irish aristocrat called, I think it's Lady Fingal, in fact, who is a personal friend of Ledwich's patron, who promoted his poetry and funded him, and you know, thought here is a talent that is worth showing the world to. And she said something very, very poignant after the war was over, and she was talking about the kind of country life back in County Meath where they had their aristocratic home. And she said, we hunted again, but ghosts rode with us. And I went, my God, what a quote that sums up losses. Okay, albeit it's the aristocracy, it's the officer class, but it's still a very poignant image in the mind. Ghosts rode with us. So I wrote that down in the Linen Hall. I went, thank you, Linen Hall. I made a few notes, thoughts about what that meant, and I think it might be one of the quotes at the start of the novel, before we get to the text itself, Simple things like that. Who have I met through the years? Well, what I can tell you is I've used the Linen Hall Library when I made documentary films and programs for various broadcasters around the world, I was fixing and producing. I've used the governor's room a few times to film in. It's a fantastic area to shoot an interview in. And I've also been in the other end of the camera. I've, with the permission of the good people who run the library, I've been interviewed myself for television in the governor's room and around the library over the years. So it's been part of my professional broadcasting life as well. You meet politicians, you meet historians. I'd see my friend Paul Buin there from time to time. You meet other writers. I bumped into quite a few politicians of all political hues. That's what I like about the place. It's a neutral space, which is something unique and unusual, and much more unique and unusual before ceasefires and peace process and all that. It was still a neutral venue, cherished by all sides. And I like the idea that, a lady member of Sinn Féin can bring in his material from H-Block protests of the 1970s and lodge it there. And then within the hour, a loyalist activist can come in and, drop off a few pamphlets of UVF prisoners wrote in Lancashire in the early 1970s. I think that's a kind of measurement of the kind of the neutrality of the space that it is. I think it's also a haven. I mean, it is a peaceful haven. I think people behave and adhere to, keeping quiet, giving people a bit of silence to write and research, and it cuts across a generation. I think there's almost a kind of a unspoken reverence and unspoken law in there when you go in. That's what you must do. I had student membership. I'm a lapsed member, and I must really take membership. But I don't live in Belfast anymore normally, but I am locked down at the moment in Belfast. I was actually researching for the novel and another book I'm writing, which I can't talk about at the minute. It's a non-fiction book. It's quite sensitive. But I was here in Northern Ireland when the lockdown happened, so I couldn't go back to England where I now live, on the south coast. So I'm going to make myself a promise. When the library's open, I'm going to rejoin membership again as one of the kind of post-lockdown treats. I miss it terribly. There are days when I get surges of inspiration. I want to go out and write, and I think, let's put the bag on. Let's throw it over the shoulder, walk the short distance to the Linen Hall Library. I only live about 15 minutes max from where the library is. I'm a city centre boy. I grew up in the city centre. So it's part of my history as well, So I would urge you all out there to, sorry for the wonkiness of the camera, I would urge all of you out there to get membership, support the library. Look it up on www.linenhall.com. It deserves support. It's a vital cultural asset that should be supported. both by the institutions here in Northern Ireland, whether that's the Arts Council or the Cultural Department in Stormont, and that it should also be supported by you, the general public, and people like me as well. Put my money where my mouth is, and because we owe it so much. We owe it so much in terms of work, whether that's your A-level history, your dissertation, your thesis, your PhD, your book, or just your cultural and mental well-being. It's a place where I can go sometimes, just sit, read, and forget about the problems that are out there or that are in here, and just escape to another world. So all the best to the Lindenhall Library, and to you, the public out there. Please keep supporting it. Thank you.